information about how our activities will impact upon delicate ecosystems, virtue would require action in accordance with the precautionary principle, the principle that demands that we do not undertake risky ventures without real confidence that we will do no harm. Now, admittedly, there is lots within these brief suggestions with which to find fault, lots that has to be unpacked, and I do some of that at the end of the paper. Let me just close with what I take to be the biggest problem with an approach that attempts to extract strong sustainability from virtue theory. The problem that bothers me most is that such a theory is, again, all about us. It's always all about us. Every time you turn around and you find a theory that's plausible, it's because it's all about us, right? It makes the value of the environment a function of the value we place on our own virtue, on our own good character. And while it might be that if all of us were as virtuous as we could be, we would act to ensure that our oceans are returned to health, for example, that their fish populations are restored, that the coral reefs are protected, that the whales are made safe, that the currents are unaffected by global warming. But even if we were so virtuous, I wouldn't think that the value of our oceans lay in the value of our exhibited virtue. And so I end with the same problem with which I began, which is that we don't seem to have a sound moral answer to the question of how strong our obligations of sustainability really are. Ethics is, in the end, fantastically anthropocentric. And it therefore proves frustratingly impotent at giving the most triumphant invasive species on the planet reasons to be more generous. With that, I'll leave it there and we'll have a conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Heidi. That was brilliant, fantastic. It's a lot food for thought. And well, I think we have plenty of time for discussion. So I'd like to know if you have questions. I'll ask you to be brief. And so Alberto, Michael, and Anna. So Alberto.
Thank you for stimulating exposition. I have basically two questions. My first question, according to your viewpoint, according to your reflection, to what extent your exposition takes us to reflect about the necessity for reformulating, for redefining the central categories of legal theory, such as rights, obligations, legitimacy, and interpretation. And my second question, from a philosophical standpoint, how do you feel the importance of the principle of intergenerational equity to build a stronger environmental protection?
Those are big.
Yeah. Would you mind if we...
Yeah, put them all together.
Yeah, sure. Michael?
It's hard for me to obey your injunction about briefness.
You have some
Well, maybe I can interpret it, given my lecture the other day.
Yeah.
So it's a syncretic aromatic adjective. This will be brief for me. This is not to say brief. So I have not heard this lecture by my wife before. You can't disagree with what I'm now going to say, Heidi. That I thought was exceptionally an elegant structure. I have two questions, but...
Yeah, I'm good you could stop there. That would be a good moment of briefness.
You know, your four models of sustainability should be seen as juxtaposed to, as I was counting, 6 different ethical theories that have different implications for whether they can sustain each of these various models of sustainability. points are these. One, I think you left out a player. If we're having a tournament of ethical theories on that right-hand column, it should be 7. Because the 6 that you had, where you had subjective utilitarianism in the narrow sense where it's restricted to human welfare. Secondly, in the broader sense where it's extended to all sentient creatures, as Bentham said, that can suffer. Thirdly, rights in the hands of Locke to Hart, which is usually the choice, or if you call it the will theory of rights, which of course only applies to creatures who can waive them. As Locke said in his 1660 lectures, this is a doctrine of freedom, but it's freedom for those with the capacity to waive their rights. Fourthly, the interest theory of rights construed deontologically, that is, with correlative categorical duties. Fifthly, the notion of rights as a consequentialist theory, and then sixthly, your erratic backstop of virtue theory. You know what's left out of that is something that looks like rights consequentialism, but it actually is distinct. It's what's usually called, in some ethics textbooks, it's called ideal utilitarianism. I rather usually call it in my ethics classes objective utilitarianism, because it deals with needs, welfare in the objective sense of what an entity that's valuable needs, rather than what it wants, what its preferences are, what makes it happy, and what gives it pleasure. The famous book on that is this book by David Graeber called Meeting Needs. It had a really famous research assistant. I don't remember what.
Really
it
did.
Oh,
She was really
It was
famous.
Heidi Hurd. But this notion of objective utilitarianism is like the interest theory of rights without all of the superstructure that rights talks gives you. Because it says, ask not what makes an object happy or satisfies its preferences or gives them pleasure or pain, ask rather what it needs. And then you get all the quotes you had on the board. Everything that has a need has a welfare, and you can develop a welfare function for it. That's still within utilitarianism, but it broadens what utilitarianism can accomplish well beyond simply very weak sustainability. So first question is just, why don't you put this knight back on the stage because you know him so well? The second question was, I was wondering, listening to you, what you were going to do with the anthropocentrism of a virtue theory of environmental ethics. But can't you answer your own question this way? Virtue theory from Aristotle on down isn't isolated from deontic theory. Namely, a virtuous person, Aristotle, a virtuous person is someone who does his deontic duties. It's not enough, but it's surely required that you do whatever deontic duties are required of you. In which event you can mix and match. You can gain strength. I call this the stew theory of ethics. You put a stew together with lots of ingredients. Each of the ingredient may not be very good by itself, but to put them together, the stew might taste great. And if you put together enough theories, no deontologist, except for Kant, who was silly, there's no deontologist who thinks you can live by rights alone. We all backstop rights theory with some kind of consequentialist theory, if you're sensible. That can be mixed with an erratic theory. Now we've got 3 things in play. So your erratic theory, although it is all about us, it's about us, but the content of the virtue is indeed about entities that have independent intrinsic worth. So I don't think you have to say, if you buy erratic, as long as you have independent worth to deontic theories, you're not as anthropocentric as you think you might be.
Well, I think we should give you the opportunity to answer and then go for a second round later.
Yes, okay. Let's see how efficiently I can do this, because the first question was, does this cause us to rethink all of Western ethics and law? Does it cause us to rethink our devotion to moral constructs and legal constructs like rights and obligations and the legal institutions that protect and realize them, including human practices like interpretation? And there are certainly environmental ethicists who have just thrown up their hands at the fact that our moral schools of thought seem to underserve our intuitions about the value of the environment. They've thrown up their hands so much that they've sort of proposed to throw out, the baby with the bathwater. They've proposed to throw out all of Western moral philosophy. And I guess I don't think that that's the answer, mostly because I have no idea what the alternative would be. That is, while rights don't seem to capture all of our moral intuitions, while utility judgments don't capture all of our moral intuitions, while virtue judgments don't capture all of our moral interests or moral intuitions, all of them surely capture some of them. And they certainly capture them in lots of contexts in the law, right? I mean, I take criminal law to be very well explained and very well justified by a retributive theory that's attentive to the deserts of wrongdoers. I take tort law to be very well explained by questions of what will maximize wealth and minimize the costs of accidents. It's a utilitarian set of considerations. I actually take bankruptcy law in my book on bankruptcy to be responsive to judgments about the virtue of a reasonably wealthy citizenry. So I'm not prepared to sort of throw out basic moral building blocks and go over to what the deep green environmentalists want to go over to, which is some mix of voodoo-ish, we're all one, tree hugging, me and the tree, we're so much like that, I can't separate me from the tree. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with that stuff. So I don't know what the alternatives would be. Future generations, I love that problem. I've never written about that problem because I find it so hard. Every time I say I'm going to write about the rights or interests or whatever moral constructs you would assign to non-existent people and non-existent, non-human entities, I've just found that an incredibly difficult problem. We all have the intuition that those folks down the road will have essentially the same needs we have. They're going to need clean water. They're going to need clean air. They're going to need wholesome food. So we're pretty confident about some of their core needs, but we don't know how much adapted preferences will alter their wants and how those adapted wants affect our current actions today. So, the next paper, or maybe the paper after the next paper. Michael, I love that you asked that question because it shows you didn't read my paper. And I never read his papers, so I'm feeling so much better now. So actually in the paper, I do deal with the suggestion that maybe we could look to an objective theory of welfare, that we could look to the notion of maximizing objective needs of all things that have needs. Or put differently, in light of work that one of our colleagues at Illinois does, we could develop a theory of flourishing, an objective theory of flourishing for all things that can flourish, and maximize that. So it's a consequentialist theory of flourishing that takes objective needs and objective conditions of more than needing, but sort of whatever you unpack flourishing to amount to. An objective theory of flourishing is the touchstone of what to maximize. What I say in the paper is this, which is as soon as you move from subjective preferences to objective whatevers, objective needs, objective conditions of flourishing, you surely left behind the welfare economists who have devoted their lives to making morality into an empirical science that amounts to running around and asking people what they prefer, what they want. They're the ones that have used democracy and capitalism as ways both of assessing preferences and of meeting preferences. So you've lost the proponents of the muscular theory of utilitarianism who have typically defined weak sustainability. That's okay, leave them behind, but it's not like they're going to think that you're speaking their language of weak sustainability if you claim to be doing what they're doing, but you're talking in terms of maximizing objective things that cause them to go nonsense on stilts, right? So you've already moved to a theory of strong sustainability. They're going to reject. At that point, hell, talk about rights. You've lost them. Your stew, absolutely, I love stews. Your stew only works if deontic theories are robust enough that virtue theory is a complement to deontic duties and deontic rights that incorporate environmental entities. If your deontic theory, if your deontological rights are not very muscular because of the reasons I advanced, because of the doctrine of double effect, and because of notions of being able to continue to risk rights violations, even though you couldn't knowingly cause them, then a lot more work has to be done by virtue. And then we're back to thinking that what accounts for the value of Mount Everest is our virtue, and that's just an incredible mismatch for me of a theory relative to my intuitions about the value of Mount Everest.
Luisa, Guilherme, Clarissa.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much. When you sustain heretic duties,
Could you speak a little bit louder?
Okay, you present examples of heretic duties as fairness, humility, generosity. And my question is, how can we point these characters without making a deontological claim about them? And I think it would be my first question. And my second question is, how could we differ in heretic duty from an emotivistic and relativistic point of view about what is subjectively available to a person? A claim that is similar to that one that Bernard Williams does. I mean, how can we differ heretic duties from an relativistic point of view about what is available, without doing this deontological approach which I referred in the first question?
Thank you very much, Professor Heidi, for your paper. My reaction, you center on page 29. You say, it seems to me that to be virtuous is to know one's place in the universe. When I think in my place in the universe, I don't become virtuous, I become nihilistic. And I think it's impossible to build a virtuous ethics from a cosmic point of view. I think it's impossible to do that. So my reaction is to claim the impossibility to have a virtuous life if I'm worthless and I have the same value as a bacteria or a rock.
Thank you very much. It was, really intriguing. Well, my question is maybe more basic. What I couldn't really grasp from the paper is what are the set of intuitions that you're trying to justify? What are the set of sustainability concerns? Because you distinguish between 4 different sustainability theories, but at some moments in the paper, it seems to me that you're claiming some parts of even the two stronger, or you're disputing some aspects of even the two stronger sustainability theories. So example, the very strong one, from what I understood, claims that we have to count every species in the planet as rights bearer, and then we have to build a distributive theory that would take all of them in consideration. But when you dispute some versions of the rights-based theory, when you're talking about deontology, you dispute the claim that because a thing is valuable, it should be considered valuable. So it seems that you're disputing the claim that every species should be taken into consideration as something valuable. So it doesn't seem to me that you are perfectly aligned with a very strong sustainability thesis. On the other hand, the strong one would claim that we should protect we should be concerned not to exhaust, right, some resources. We should be concerned with protecting, not exhausting resources or species. Then it seems, then you don't give, by this theory, you don't give sufficient weight to some individuals from certain species that you would want to consider as right bearers. So it seems that you're in the middle, you're claiming a bit of one and a bit of the other one, but you don't actually endorse any of those thoroughly. So what would you say about that?
Okay. These are wonderful. These are really, really, really probing questions. And like the first two, they poke at real soft spots. And so I'm probably not going to have great answers to any of the three of these. But the first one, it's tempting to think that we can't make sense of claims of virtue without making claims about what our rights and duties are, or what others' rights and duties are. What would make it non-virtuous of me to cut down a sequoia tree for pulp if the sequoia tree doesn't have rights, or if there aren't cumulative interests that speak against it, right? How do I get a virtue judgment about cutting down a sequoia tree if we can't say anything about why it would be deontically wrong to cut down the sequoia tree? It's a wonderful question. I think we make virtue judgments a lot. That is, we make character assessments a lot without the notion that there are rights or duties that are being offended. I mean, if you think about your daily life, we rarely confine gossip to discussions of people's actions. We are really fast to move to points about character. I mean, Michael and I will be sitting in a restaurant, and 3 tables over, there'll be some woman who's going, and I am so fast to go, narcissist, right? I am so fast to move from the particularly relatively strong incursion on our tranquility to a judgment of character, right? And that's how gossip works. If you watch your gossip, you take itty-bitty actions, many of which are not rights violations, many of which do not violate deontic duties, but we are fast to draw character judgments from them. We think people have a right to speak even when they say vile things. Well, at least we Americans do, because we're under some constitutional obligation to think that. But we actually think that, right? We think that what it means to have a right to speak is not always to speak popular, not always to say what others want to hear. The whole value of speech is to be able to offend. And so we think people have a right to speak even if violate, and yet we think it's vicious for them to do so. We think they exhibit poor character when they capitalize on the right to free speech to say vile things to others. So I still think there's a considerable gap between what we can say deontically and what we can say archaically. And as soon as you see that gap, you see that I get to exploit it to say that we can reach judgments about people's character with regard to their interactions with the environment without saying things about the environment of a rights-based, duty-based, or utility-based sort. Knowing one's place in the universe and therefore assuming a cosmic perspective that makes you feel so insignificant, what the hell? Burn the place down. That's a brilliant comment. I've never heard that before. I didn't even know what to say to that. It does remind me a little bit of the forces that got us Trump, but that's because I'm now thinking of everything every day in light of what in the world got us Trump. The notion that globalism threatened Americans, caused them to feel insignificant in their own vastly luxurious, important country. So much so that they have to say, us first, we're the victim in the world, America first. Because what, they're threatened by globalism? They feel themselves too small as Americans to be able to tolerate globalism? Are you kidding? But maybe what you've said is psychologically very astute. So I have to think about that some more. I'm not sure I'm committed to a cosmic perspective, right? From a cosmic perspective, everything's trivial, right? From a cosmic perspective, from a cosmic perspective, human beings are surely a fast-moving invasive species that, like flower beetles, are going to burn themselves out, and the planet can then restore itself over the billion years after, right? From a cosmic perspective, why in the world are we doing philosophy as opposed to lying on the beach? So I don't think I'm committed to that perspective when it comes to asking questions about what a person of good character does on a planet of shrinking resources with lots of other entities who are competing for those. I think it's much more the perspective of somebody who's interested in distributive justice and has a generous view of those who are to be counted as the distribution takes place. And finally, where I am on the map. Oh, cool, that's so astute. Notice that I'm, yeah. Of course I'm more drawn to the strongest theory. I find it hard to say that a life form that owes billions of years of evolution for its presence on Earth can be legitimately eradicated, even if that's the last vestiges of the smallpox, virus that we have, that the World Health Organization is keeping in a vault, right? I often give my students that question, should we eradicate the last container's worth of a stunningly deadly virus, when that's to deliberately, purposefully eradicate a species? I have a hard problem with that. So you're right that I'm really drawn to the strong theory of sustainability. On the other hand, I'm not anxious to alienate everybody who says, I brought a quote for your question. I can't answer your question. I just brought a quote for it to bolster your question. Who says, with Wilfred Beckerman, must we preserve intact the environment as we find it today in all forms? This is him reacting to a very strong sustainability proponent. Can there be no mining, no industry? Could no species ever go extinct, or any non-renewable resources ever be taken, however many people are starving? Are we to elevate the needs of mice over the wants of humans? Okay, I wanted to write the paper, sitting somewhere between the third and the fourth theory of strong sustainability. These are, after all, on a continuum. So, suggesting that somewhere in the continuum arena of the third and the fourth is a legitimate place to be. Nothing I've said contradicts. Nothing I've said in favor or against the third position, sort of is contradictory relative to the fourth position. They're different positions. They are on a continuum of sort of the degree to which you find it plausible to say that even smallpox has a claim to moral considerability in our calculations about what to do with it. So I'm just going to sit there and confess.
So, Andrea?
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. Reading your paper was really inspiring. Not only because your arguments and your distinctions are crystal clear, but also because your paper reminds us of the role of philosophy in assessing practical issues, and it reminds us of the role of character traits and sometimes not rational dispositions in doing the right thing. My question is about your categories of anthropocentric ethics and intrinsic value. Sometimes reading your paper, I got confused about, the problem of ethical theories are in being done from a human perspective, or the problem of ethical theories is because they cannot account for the intrinsic value that we humans we humans attribute two things. I don't know whether my question is clear, but these two categories are analytically and logically distinct. And sometimes reading your paper, I got confused about whether the problem is an ethics done by a human perspective or an ethics that is not able to consider the intrinsic value of things. And sorry, just to and if the problem is the first one, if the problem is that ethic and moral theories are done from a human perspective, which will be the alternative? Is there any possible ethics that can be done from a non-human perspective? What could this mean? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Heidi, for your lecture. My question relates a little bit with Professor Moore's suggestion of these two. My question would be, where should we draw the line between when we start applying a virtuous theory, a rights theory, and a consequentialist theory? Because, for instance, if we think about the problem you mentioned of free speech, if we apply a virtuous theory, for instance, regarding to hate speech, for instance, we would come up with a different answer than with a rights-based theory. And relating more to the question of sustainability, how could we say, where should we draw the line specifically? Like when we started talking about nature and human beings, should we draw the line?
Thanks for the lecture, Professor. I've noticed that by the end of your paper, you quoted the music from Pocahontas.
A little bit louder.
Yeah, I've noticed that you've quoted a song from Pocahontas by the end of the paper.
Isn't that a great song?
Yeah, and it reminded me of another song from the same movie, in which it says, "How high does a sycamore grow? If you cut it down, you'll never know." So I thought that sometimes maybe this is somehow related to our sensibilities, to our intuition regarding nature. And I think plenty of times this intuition is linked somehow to our aesthetic perception of nature. Of course, this maybe is something that goes a little bit, like, it's deeper than what the paper pretended to do, but I'd like to know whether some kind of answer to this hard question wouldn't be in our aesthetic perception of nature, in the way that sometimes we assume that what is inspiring or what is beautiful is somehow good.
Great. Do these? Yes. Okay. So first question. It's a really nice question to probe what it means for a theory to be anthropocentric, and to recognize that, of course, human beings are the only species that we know of to date that are moral agents, that are persons in the morally loaded sense, that are capable of executing duties and making rational choices and developing and reasoning about the ambit of moral rights. But while ethics can only be done or practiced by humans, that doesn't mean it has to be about humans. And that's the sense in which I mean that an ethical theory is anthropocentric. I mean that it's anthropocentric if it takes us, if it takes humans, to be the repository of value. So things have value only if we value them. And if we don't value them or don't value them enough, that exhausts the question of their moral considerability and our obligations towards them. So I take it to be the case that, well, of course, we're the only moral agents on the planet to date. I love that. As soon as you say something like that, the biologists are all over claims like that these days. finding capacities in elephants and dolphins. I don't know if you guys saw the story the other day about the killer whale who dragged her baby 2,000 miles, where they found they plausibly took it to be a manifestation of grief, so that there are animals that are demonstrating what you might think of as the moral emotions. That doesn't make them moral agents, it doesn't mean they have capacities for morality, but it is interesting that we're finding what are called the moral emotions in entities other than humans. But if we stipulate that humans are the only moral agents, it doesn't mean that morality takes as its content only those things that humans value. And that, of course, then is what gives rise to the paper. The stew, where to draw the line between 2 or 3 or 4 different kinds of normative considerations. I am a pluralist. I love stews. I do think that ultimately there are a number of decisions. Many decisions are probably made simply by asking what people prefer. On what day to start law school at the beginning of the term? On what days to have national holidays? On what day to have everybody pay their taxes? There are lots and lots of questions that on a daily basis for you and your family and your professors and your classmates are just properly decided on good old utilitarian grounds, right? Just poll people, figure out what will maximize their preferences. But I do take there to be rights that, once bumped into, assert themselves as trumping devices. Now, where that line is requires a theory that I haven't given in this paper, and that's sort of all of first order moral philosophy is about providing the content of your highest and best theory of when preferences stop to do the work and rights begin, right? It's your theory of the content of rights. Do people have a right to speech, or is speech only an instrumental value to something else? Do people have, a right to gay marriage? Do people have a right to? These are all the questions that are the substantive theory of rights, not the content of the paper. Same with virtue. I do take virtue to sort of to run along on a kind of parallel track. We can always be asking what we need to do as a deontic matter, whatever the content of that is, and how to be the kind of person that over our lifetimes is thought to be a virtuous person. I don't think those are so much trade-offs, and it would be ironic if they were, as just considerations about different aspects of normativity. And that brings me to the question of aesthetics. I'm really eager to write an article with my daughter, who's an artist, who wants to talk about the degree to which aesthetic normativity is doing a fair bit of work to inform our theory of the value of the environment. Notice that would be to add to Michael's stew. It would be to add another ingredient. It would be to say I've left off yet another player on the menu of possible explanations, and that is aesthetic. Now again, an aesthetic theory of the value of the environment is again anthropocentric in the sense that it's all about what we aesthetically appreciate. Even if you have an objective theory of aesthetics, realism about aesthetics, that's tough. I'm going to let my daughter write that side of that paper because I don't know anything about aesthetics, but it's extremely tempting. It's extremely tempting to think aesthetics play a big role. And that theories of aesthetics could be really helpful in working out different additional menu entries as we try to make sense of our intuitions about the environment.
Any more? So I have a question too. So,
Thank you, Professor. Right in the beginning of your paper, you said, I shall resist the temptation to suggest that there are some things that should not be commodified, even if they can be. My question is, isn't this what our deep-seated intuitions suggest? And if so, why did you put aside this starting point?
Great question.
Thank you, Professor. I actually really enjoy your paper, and my two questions are, in a certain sense, an attempt to answer your own objections to your solution on the paper. And the first one is this. You are, by the end of the paper, that as a general matter, I'm quoting you, we do not assign guilt to persons by virtue of their mere association with others who are guilty. So why would we think that the archaic duties that persons have are properly responsive to the history and past behavior of the Homo sapiens? And my first question is this. Why should this be a problem? Because our idea of personal responsibility is only loosely connected with the idea of guilt, and is also connected with the idea of shame. One can be ashamed without actually being responsible in terms of morality's duties. And since virtues are related with excellence, with the idea of being a good person, an excellent person, we could easily deal with this problem you point with some sort of idea of shame, how ashamed I would be if I did something. So actually we could treat this problem with the question, in the end of the day, what kind of person I want to be. Of course, and that's the first part of the first question. The second part is, there is also, related to responsibility, ideas of responsibility that are not personal. We have, for instance, I'm not a very fan of this idea, but it's also a player in the field. We have this idea that, for instance, some people, like white people in America, can have some sort of collective responsibility because of slavery. Therefore, affirmative action is morally required. That's a kind of argument that's possible to be made, and I think that's also a player or an ingredient for this too. And my second question is, what's the problem after all with the idea that, well, when it comes to theoretical theory, everything is about us. The only plausible alternative to something that is about us is some sort of realism, some sort of moral realism, to believe that the Niagara Falls or the Grand Canyon have value even if there were no humans to actually see the value. And this, of course, brings a lot of problems in terms of what kind of metaphysical grounds you need to make sense of this kind of intuitions people have. And so that's the question. In the end of the day, what's the problem with the idea? Well, it's all about us. Those are the two questions.
Heidi, I have 2 points too. One is, you used many times this image of the stew. And this image can be a deceptive image, because it can bring together somehow the idea of some kind of eclecticism, that we can mix together many different strands of moral methodologies, and I'm sure you wouldn't agree with this. So I would like to know more about how do you think this idea of having some kind of strong methodology in moral thought. If so, how would you describe your own? And connected with this idea, and you've mentioned many times this in the end of your paper and the end of your lecture, the way by which you understand how we should consider nature as having an intrinsic value. And I'd like to know, how would you compare this idea with, for example, with the way that some other authors consider some similar ideas, like, for example, Ronald Dworkin considered the idea of intrinsic value